contemporary literature and art. Tonight, we're very glad to welcome 8 truly brilliant writers and artists in a program that speaks to multiple ongoing global crises, including racism, right-wing political violence, closed borders, and anti-immigrant sentiments. Before we get started, I did want to say a few words about Beyond Baroque and our ongoing programs. First, I would like to acknowledge Beyond Baroque's presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. We recognize the wrong done to these peoples through settler colonialism, genocidal practices, and the violent dispossession of their land. In terms of Beyond Baroque's programs, we offer a wide range of workshops and readings. This month we have our ongoing free workshops, which have helped launch the careers of writers and artists that range from Wanda Coleman, the punk band X, to the poet Amy Gersler, and also notably America's youngest ever inaugural poet, Amanda Gorman, whom read powerfully at yesterday's inauguration. At the moment, the poet Beth Ruscio is teaching our Wednesday night poetry workshop, which has been running continuously since 1969. Meanwhile, our Monday night fiction workshop is starting up again on January 25th with Raquel Baker. Both Raquel and Beth are fabulous writers and workshop leaders, so I hope you'll check those out. We'll also be announcing a pretty large slate of new workshops soon, so stay tuned for that. We also have a number of upcoming readings. On January 26th, we have a reading with What Books Press, one of LA's finest literary presses. And on January 28th, we have Poets Translate Poets, which is a transnational bilingual program focused on translation between Spanish and English. Well, 3 poet translators join us from Mexico, including Elisa Diaz-Castello, Jorge Ortega, and Elsa Cross, while Anthony Simon and David Shook will join us from here in the United States. So please do return for that next week. I should say also, we'd very much appreciate any donations you can make as part of the evening. You'll find a link in the chat or on our website to do that. COVID-19 has been devastating for many, many arts organizations, and Beyond Baroque is no exception. We still don't know when we'll be able to reopen, so any amount you can donate helps us sustain ourselves until that time. And I would also really, really encourage everyone to also buy our authors' books. They're all really, truly fantastic writers. You'll find a link to their books for sale also in the chat. So let's focus on tonight's program. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to have Taz Ahmed, Neelanjana Banerjee, Torsa Ghosal, Sorayya Khan, Arshia Fatima Haq, Mahmud Rahman, and Shreerekha Subramanian join us for this evening's program. And I should also say this program was organized and will be hosted by the truly wonderful, inspiring Sehba Sarwar. Sehba will say more about the program in just a moment. Before turning things over to her, however, I did want to thank poets and writers for their financial support of this program. I also want to thank our partners, Los Angeles Poet Society, Tia Chucha Press, the Tuesday Night Project. Each of these organizations does incredible work in the community. I hope you'll check them out and support the work that they do. I also wanted to offer thanks to our many community members and organizations for supporting the reading. Those include the South Asian Network, South Asian American Digital Archive, Bookswell, Pakistan Arts Council, USC, and more. It's a long list of thanks, but one thing I didn't want to forget to include is to thank all of you for being here. In the face of a global pandemic and multiple political crises, literary community has never been more important. So it's wonderful to have a crowd of people here for some very important readings. Finally, last but not least, I want to thank our host and organizer, Sehba Sarwar. She's a brilliant writer, a tremendous teacher, and a profoundly inspiring literary activist. Sehba, why don't you go ahead and take us away? Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Quentin, for your wonderful introduction. As Quentin said, my name is Sehba Sarwar. I am delighted to welcome you to our program, South Asian Writers Resist. Today, January 21st, is particularly poignant in this country because we can celebrate yesterday's inauguration and the end to a repressive regime. As you know, though, the work still needs to be done, and we are here to do it with you, share our voices with you. We gather across global borders and recognize solidarity in South Asia, across the oceans, and in the United States. Many thanks to Beyond Baroque for offering this virtual platform, to Quentin Ring and Jimmy Vega for all your support. As writers share work, please keep your eyes on the chat, as Quentin said, where you can post there. We're seeing all your messages, and I wish I could chat with each of you right now, but I need to move the program along, so I won't, but I will in just a bit. On the chat group, Jimmy will be posting a list of books and anthologies that you can purchase and support writers. Everything you purchase, a little amount will go to Beyond Baroque, and they are such an amazing, historic, and powerful organization. Any extra money they get, they deserve. Donate generously and purchase freely. Thank you for joining us in a celebration of words. Please use the chat function and comment, as you already are. The featured writers and I will begin the evening by reading a poem, Postcard from Kashmir by Agha Shahid Ali. Almost 18 months have slipped away since the Indian government revoked Kashmir of its special status, pushing Kashmiri citizens into a new level of occupation. Today's gathering is dedicated to Kashmiris and to all the citizens around the world who struggle for their freedom to express their voices and to cross borders, to migrants, refugees, laborers, communities who are on lockdown, to those protesting and struggling against police violence, racism, and gender violence, and in our pandemic times, to those lost and those grieving loved ones. This poem that we will read together is called Postcard from Kashmir by Agha Shahid Ali, 1949 to 2001.
Kashmir shrinks into my mailbox, my home a neat 4 by 6 inches.
I always loved neatness. Now I hold the half-inch Himalayas in my hand.
This is home, and this is the closest I'll ever be to home. When I return,
colors won't be so brilliant. The Jhelem's water's so clean.
So ultramarine, my love so overexposed.
And my memory will be a little out of focus. In it,
a giant negative, black and white, still undeveloped.
Thank you. It was so beautiful. A life lost, Agha Shahid Ali. And now get ready. You will hear powerful work by South Asian writers in Houston, San Francisco Bay Area, Ithaca, Sacramento, and of course, LA, where Beyond Baroque is based. Please note, we will not interrupt the flow of today's program by reading bios. Those will be posted in the chat box by Jimmy Vega. The first writer tonight is Taz Ahmed.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. I have 2 old pieces and 1 new piece that I wrote in honor of the repeal of the Muslim ban that happened yesterday. It was one of the first executive orders that Biden signed. And I've been thinking a lot about what's happened in these past 4 years. So that's why I dusted off these old poems, and I'll read those. I'll start with those 2. This one's called Speak English Only. They tell me my tongue is not mine, forked and split into 2, tasting like grit from my mother's grave. The metallic ting of thuggy cults spilled blood, like the language of their oppressors, holding a knife to my throat, suppressing speech into silence. Tell me then, how am I supposed to speak out, shout loud, rebel scream from margins, when the only language I understand leaves my colonized lips dry-mouthed, thirsty for what is lost? I am not speechless. I am wordless. This affect is deliberate, pidgin English vocal fried, code switched to oblivion, cultural commodity sold back to me. I no longer know what voice is my own. Okay, this one's called The Intimacy of a Knife Fight. We step into each other's spheres, weapons drawn, dancing around the resilience of our resistance. Hip to hip, we trip, catching each other from falling into the madness of it all. My knuckles bleed, caressing his jawline. My blood is life, so I live. Bruises bloom from where his elbow seated, a testament that my life is worth protecting. His hand grabs my wrist to remind me I am present, I am here. When my knife slices and I feel his skin give, but not cut, on my blade, I know I am not alone. His gaze reads me and gives me permission to go harder. You are stronger than you think you are, he says. I tackle him. I feel his breath on my neck, a faint hint of tobacco, the heat of his sweaty skin, a slight pause as we embrace before I use my ribs to run down along his arms, then crush his hand to my waist till disarmed. I gasp, he exhales. Our racing hearts loud. My fight makes me guarded, but this closeness makes me vulnerable and wanting more. The only time I touch another human being is in this intimacy of knife fight class. Is this what it means to love when a dystopian future is forcing us to submit? We must learn to protect each other, to resist. Endorphins and adrenaline and oxytocin and ecstasy, fear and rage and pain and blood and fists and skin, survival and caresses and strength and life. When our skin touches, I am reminded of my humanness in this dehumanizing world. So we fight for love and we love for the fight, intimacy reimagined and transformed. And I have one last piece. I literally just finished this like 2 hours ago, so let's see how it goes. And we stormed the airports across the nation, our postmodern port of entries. We were drawn because we had all heard the clarion call. The sound had come through our secret signal messages and broadcasted subtext. The revolution was televised and the regime change was on Twitter. Like azan from the minarets at the corner of the country, we congregated where our people were known to cross borders. Armed with nothing but bullhorns, cardboard signs, and our resounding voices, hundreds of people, no, thousands of people made their way to LAX and JFK and O'Hare and SFO and SeaTac and Logan. We had been preparing for this moment, even though we didn't know we had been. Our weapons were our words and our ammunition were our bodies. So we stood our bodies in planted place and screamed out words and call and response waves. We marched back and forth on the airport sidewalks with other protesters screaming chants at the top of our lungs. We made sure those detained heard our voice calling for them, and we deployed lawyers to those detained to free them. Together we prayed in the halls in front of the patrol office, and others stood watch to allow us to pray. People were in awe at the power we held, and we were in awe of how we had all been called for this moment. The reporters and journalists desperately covered the spectacle, placing upon us safety pin narratives. Who would be the white savior of these people if they could save themselves? How exotic to mark regime change with this first action, they would say, but not the last, we knew. This rebel insurgency was not terrorism, domestic or otherwise. We did not have guns or zip ties or machetes. We did not break down doors or violently maim or chase conspiracy theories. This uprising was not in spite, but despite the invisible targets that had been placed on our brown and black bodies. Our existence was weaponized, so we made our presence alone the weapon. We would take it to the biggest courts of the land and gather signatures on our home computers. We would stage a sit-in at the Capitol in front of government officials, and we would sit with border split families. We would be handcuffed for our voices, and we would legislate with our words. We would reunite parents with children to only have them be torn apart all over again. In the end, history books will not remember that we won, but we won. They will say a white male savior signed for our freedom 4 years later. They will say that the newest regime change is what got us our freedom back, not the battle that was actually fought. And then they will share photos of him signing a document and putting the pen that he used to sign it in a renowned museum. But that is not our win. The history books will get it wrong because it is impossible to document how our community dreamt together and cared for one another and kept secrets side by side. There will be no archives of the disappearing signal messages or deleted photos of faces of Muslim activists for surveillance did not end with this. There will be no recollections of how the humorous protest signs made us giggle and the oxytocin rush when we hugged each other and how we felt light when we prayed shoulder to shoulder. We cried till we laughed and we laughed till we cried. In these spaces, we felt, empathized, and emoted. We showed radical expressions of love and experienced collective joy. We showed up for ourselves and we showed up for one another because this was the future we wanted to be. The FOIA requests of the historians will miss these invisible in the indivisibles. Our wins are intangible because how do you archive that feeling of love? They tried to dehumanize us by putting a bullseye on our skin, but in each other we found humanity, and we reminded each other how to be human again. We allowed ourselves to reimagine a different world for ourselves, and this is how we won. Thank you so much, everyone.
I think you're supposed to introduce me, but I'll introduce myself.
Oh, sorry. We have Neelanjana Banerjee,
Thank you.
writer and poet and bestie here in Los Angeles with me.
That was so beautiful, Taz. Thank you so much for sharing brand new work on this day. So exciting to be here with all of you and see all these names in the chat and read with all these amazing authors. Big thank you to Beyond Baroque and Quentin and especially Sehba for coming up with this great reading and for us to be here today, which feels like a good day to read. So thank you, everyone, and I'm excited to be here. Lately, I've been thinking about my uncle Sergio, who was an infantry soldier in the US Army for over 25 years. I'll share an excerpt from a story I wrote inspired by him entitled The Songs in Sam's Head, which was actually published in a special South Asian issue of the journal Chicago Quarterly Reader by editor Mozam Sheikh, who I see is with us today. So hi, Mozam. In the story, after the 6-month Gulf War in Kuwait, Sam is enlisted to translate and direct civilian workers from Bangladesh and other countries to help build Kurdish refugee camps. Here's a part from the middle of the story. Sam shook his head and walked around to the front of the truck to see if he could find someone to tell him what to do. The hood of the tractor was open, and Sam saw 2 wiry brown legs sticking out, the soles of the bare feet with calloused skin. "Hello?" Sam called. "Hello?" a muffled voice answered from under the car. Then a small, dark-skinned man shimmied his way out. He was wearing an ill-fitting Coca-Cola t-shirt, black with oil stains, and a pair of torn trousers. His thick, dark hair mushroomed from his head, and his nose was both squashed and crooked. As soon as he saw Sam, he smiled widely, and the whiteness of his 2 rows of teeth was like a bolt of lightning. "Indian?" the man asked, and suddenly Sam recognized his accent. "Yeah, I'm Indian. You speak English?" "Yes, boss, I speak," the man said, wobbling his head in a way that Sam remembered shopkeepers doing when his mother pressed them about cheating her with faulty scales back in Calcutta. "You are American soldier?" The man was beaming in such a way that Sam wasn't sure whether to feel proud or suspicious. He noticed the sizable gap between the man's 2 front teeth. "That's right. I'm here to translate for the workers. Are you in charge here?" No, I'm just driver. The truck needs fix." The man pointed to the truck. "Too much trouble on the road." "Where are you coming from?" "Mina Saud, supply ships at the port." The man stepped over to inspect the engine again. "The road has been worse since Iraq fall." "So you real American soldier, huh? What's your name, boss?" "I'm Sam. Well, my real name is Shambhu Roy." The man turned toward Sam and his smile grew so big, Sam worried he might be wrong in the head. "Apni ki Bangali?" the man asked incredulously, and it took a moment for the words to sink in. "Are you Bengali?" Sam nodded his head, smiling back. "Huh, Ami Bangali." The man laughed loudly, and suddenly Sam realized that he wasn't so much of a man, probably not too much older than Sam, perhaps 25 at the oldest. He thumped Sam on the back like an old friend and ran over to the driver's side of the truck, motioning Sam to stay where he is. He pulled a small package wrapped in pink plastic and rubber bands out of the glove compartment and went about unwrapping it. Finally, he produced a miniature bottle of whiskey, the kind you find in hotel rooms. "Where did you get that?" Sam asked with amazement as the man pushed it into his hands. "Drink, drink," the man said in Bengali, and Sam thought of his mother standing over him at the dinner table, making sure he drained his glass of milk. Sam took a small, fiery sip and handed it back to the man, who also took a little sip, leaving just enough for another day. "In Mina, you can get many things on the docks. Listen, whatever you want, you can get. What do you want, Sahib Dada? Tell me, I will get it for you. What do you want? Tell me. Just tell me and I'll bring it." There was something about the way the Bengali sounded in this place, the fast way it rolled off the man's tongue, the lisping Bangladeshi accent that filled up Sam's head. Suddenly, there were words in his mind that he hadn't thought of for over a year, sounds that he knew more completely than any other sound, and here they were, erupting from this stranger's mouth next to a truck full of bullet holes in the middle of a desert that Sam had been wandering for months. During the aughts, the war on terror, the Bush years, my uncle Surjo, my Chotka, was my muse. I wrote endlessly about him, how he immigrated to the US in the 1970s as a preteen and lived in Ohio and Oklahoma. Tough places, but he got by being good at football. Then how my grandmother enlisted him in the US Army and went back to India. Adopted by Uncle Sam, I wrote in a poem. He was an outcast in my high-achieving Indian American family, possibly an alcoholic later in his life. Creditors would call our house looking for him. He never married or had a girlfriend that I knew about, but he was full of humor and laughter and tragedy and stories. He was a troublemaker of the first degree, which didn't bode well in a system that was predicated on order and obedience. I remember how once, after he came home from a trip where he spoke rusty Hindi to civilian workers in Iraq, he got into a fight at a bar near his base in Texas, punched a commanding officer who was being racist, and almost got kicked out of the army. My family was so upset at his behavior. It was not how an adult should act. But at the time, it was the most heroic thing I'd ever heard. I wrote about that bar fight for years. I was in my mid-20s, ferocious and refusing to write South Asian narratives that were familiar or domestic. He is a portal to what is happening in the world, I thought. This Indian man fighting for a country that barely pays him. This is how to drill down into what matters. After he passed away in 2016, I got a small smattering of his things from my mother's house in Ohio. There is a photo of him from Saddam Hussein's palace circa 2003. My uncle in his desert fatigues on an ornate sofa in a hall of mirrors with glowing chandeliers reflecting back into eternity. His M16 rifle slung casually across his lap. I had given up on these stories, not sure where Sam and my uncle intersected, unable to continue to write about places I had never been. It felt as though I had failed. I began working in earnest on a novel about domestic issues. But lately, I've been thinking about him at the crossroads of so much history, about living and dying in America without ever going home, about what a life could mean. Thank you. Our next reader will be Torsa Ghosal.
Thank you, Neelanjana. I'll be reading flash fiction, so it doesn't require a lot of contextualization, but I will say a few sentences about its history after reading the story. Camp City. Your friend showed you pictures of trees cloaked in spider web when you were on a smoking break. You both had been recruited to repair the boundary fence that cut through the uneven fields and dirt roads separating Camp City from the rest of Noida district. The repair work was one of many projects underway this summer. Between taking drags on your beery, you pinched the screen of your friend's phone and enlarged the photo. The spider webs were unbroken, enormous, like the nets your neighbors cast in the Churni River to catch fish. Only here, the nets had caught trees. Dense crowns of babul trees smothered in thick mesh brought back the stifling nights of your childhood when 3 generations of your family lay on the dirt floor under one blanket. Your grandmother snored beside you. The pungent odor of mustard oil coming from the back of her head was still stuck in your nose, though she was gone. A flood drove millions of spiders out of their homes and into the trees. Your friend shared everything he had learned about the picture on WhatsApp. By the time the flood water receded, the spiders had released thousands of yards of silk to clothe all the branches and leaves. The webbed trees trapped other insects now. The greatest spider movement in history, your friend said and chuckled, aping the news anchor who comes on TV every night to list the largest, the biggest, the greatest happenings around the country. Events that were supposed to happen long ago were finally happening in India under the big man's leadership. History was moving with 2 pairs of legs in the air, 2 on the ground. Your supervisor hollered at you. You crushed the butt of your beery and returned to the fence line with your friend to join the other men at work. There was a coil of razor wire for you to pick up. You stretched it with your sweating hands. Your friend crouched to mark the level on the wood post where you had to fasten an end of the metal before climbing the ladder to wrap it all the way up. The new and improved fence would be 8 foot high, much higher than the original barricade your ancestors saw when they arrived 70 years ago. The earlier fence had been installed to hold people who had crossed over from one side of darkness to another in a newly split nation. There were still kilometers of mending to do and days of wages to be earned. The sun, a festering boil in the sky, was slowing down everyone. Your grandparents had fled East Pakistan and entered India through Benapole. Like everyone else living in Camp City, they had not wanted to come. When you were starving, they told you stories about the acres and acres of land they had on the other side. Everyone in Camp City said the same stories. They had all left large farms and huge houses and jewelry behind. But the only story that meant anything to you was that of your grandparents' last days in Borishal. They bathed their mud home with water before going to sleep every night. The damp walls, they hoped, would take a while to catch fire if rioters attacked in the dead of the night. That would give them enough time to rise and run. That was no way to live, you thought, and you were grateful that they had the good sense to take a boat, then a steamer, to cross the Bay of Bengal. Both vessels crammed beyond capacity, you had heard. In all the jostling, passengers fell and drowned before crossing the border. Your little aunt, a 6-year-old girl, was among those lost at sea. Camp City, a basti devised out of tarpaulin tents, was supposed to be a temporary address. The government had issued refugee cards, promised land and citizenship to your grandparents. Your family stayed on in Camp City, believing better days were just around the corner. Look how that turned out. Long periods without work, scarce food. Even the wood posts of the boundary fence had begun to rot. The wires sagged from the weight of drying clothes. Now, all these years later, things were looking up. There was a burst of activities around the construction of a detention facility in the middle of Camp City. When the day's work ended, you watched the sky churn. Out of the floating clouds, stars appeared like earthen lamps lit in the memory of ancestors. Perhaps it would rain. The supervisor generally paid and dismissed all the workers without a word. Today, he asked, "Who among you can read and write?" You sensed there would be more and perhaps less tedious work for the literate. You promptly raised your hand and nudged your friend to do the same. He was class 8 pass. You had dropped out of school after failing 5th standard. "Good," said the supervisor, and noted down your names. "You will hear from me." It was August, and the fence repair work was all but done when the supervisor wooed you out of the line. "You will not want for work anymore," he assured you. The government had drawn a register of citizens. The literate had to go door to door, check papers, match names on identity cards with the register. People without papers would be swallowed whole by the brick and mortar detention facility. People with papers could go on living freely. You had to begin with your neighbors in Camp City. Heat crept up from your toe to head. Your friend tried to say something, breach the silence that swathed you, but the supervisor cut in. "You have the big man's word. Help him catch the pests, and you will have nothing to fear." The faces of your ancestors were dark specks spotting your past and future. You recalled your grandmother's delirious murmur, and your head got light. In her sleep, she had said she cast her own daughter into the sea. The journey from that side to this was long, and the girl was ill. You had covered your ears in horror and turned your back to your grandmother. But you understood, even then. Later, you chose to believe your little aunt was caught in a fisherman's net. She was hauled to dry land, her lungs not yet flooded, her mouth full of fish. Thank you. So that's the story. The history recounted in the story is based on Cooper's Camp in Ranaghat, which is a large refugee settlement set up in the 1950s. The inhabitants have not yet been granted Indian citizenship, nor have they been rehabilitated in any form. So with that, I'll introduce our next piece. Our next segment will be a break from literary readings. Here's Arshia Fatima Haq to offer more background about the conversation.
Thank you, Torsa, and thank you, Beyond Baroque and Sehba, for having me. I was really happy to be able to bring some music to this evening, because music can be such a powerful force of resistance in spaces where perhaps words and other forces can't reach. Sound is one of the few things that can cross a border without sanction and permit, and also a very important element of resistance, especially for marginalized people, is the element of pleasure and embodiment. So I kind of wanted to share a piece of a story that I got to explore a few years ago with a diaspora artist named Nermeen Niazi, who is a kind of a perfect example of the transnational kind of enmeshment that I'm really interested in with my project Discostan. She was a Pakistani immigrant to Birmingham and recorded a really amazing album at the age of 14 in 1984. And I got to go meet her a few years ago and learn her story. So going to share a little piece of that this evening.
I'm an immigrant myself, and I'm an avid collector of music from South and West Asia and North Africa. Over the years, I've amassed hundreds of records from these regions, lush cinema scores, lo-fi pop records, everything in between. But this record... It had a sound that was different from anything I'd heard before. Something lost and something found, intimate and epic. A synthesized new wave dream, but in my beloved native language. Listening to the album over the last few years, I had built up a story in my head. A teenage girl recording in a studio somewhere in Karachi or Lahore, back in the homeland. But I was blown away when I learned that this Urdu language record was made in the diaspora. Why would a teenager making music in England in the 80s decide to sing in Urdu? I wondered if Narmeen's story was similar to my own in some ways, if she was trying to find a sense of home through music.
Well, hello. Come in. Nice to meet you. It's cold, isn't it?
Narmeen lives with her family in the outskirts of London in a small market town called Epsom. It's the same Epsom you know from the salts discovered there. These days, she's an officer for the London Metropolitan Police. But I can still see the girl from that cover, even without the fabulous 80s garb and crowning mullet.
I was born in Lahore, in Pakistan, but most of my life has been spent in England.
Narmeen and her brother Faisal grew up between Birmingham and Pakistan, descended from music royalty. Their grandfather was the director of Radio India before partition. Their mother is Nahid Niazi, a famous playback singer in the 1950s and 60s. And their father, Muslihuddin, had a considerable career in Pakistani film and TV.
I think my mother's love of music started from a very young age. From what I recall, she may have only been 3 or 4 years old. And the passion just grew for her. That's what she's told me. And it got to a point where I think members of the family objected to her wanting to possibly sing. But somehow she managed to break the mold. And I think she was about 15, actually the same age as me, when she sang her first song. She, in so many ways, changed so many things for the women in my family. So many of them became more courageous about wanting to pursue different things, not just music. So by this point, obviously, by the time I was born, music was totally accepted within the family.
In the late 60s, England was sponsoring South Asian musicians to come and perform for its immigrant communities. And when the war with East Pakistan broke out, Narmeen's family made a permanent move.
So when we left Pakistan, we settled initially in London, and then we moved from London to Birmingham. My parents did a lot of entertaining work. And so we would go to TV studios, we would go to shows with them across the country.
Faisal and I thought this was normal. We thought that all fathers sat in the front room composing music. And I thought it was normal for mums to glam up and dress up and put makeup on and then appear on stage. So you can imagine my surprise and my shock as I got older and realized that actually we were from a very unusual family and that, mum and dad were actually very unusual people. This was all going into our ears as we're growing up. Again, we are taking this for granted, not realizing what we're actually learning and what we're actually picking up about classical Ghosal, as well as, just your modern Pakistani music.
Immigrants are faced with many choices. They can assimilate and fully adopt the customs of their new home, erasing at least some degree of what they came with, or they can shut out external influences, protecting their traditions and histories. Narmeen's family walked a line between the two. They raised their kids in English society and sent them to be homeschooled by their family in Pakistan.
Where you grow up really does kind of never leave you in a way. You sort of, remember the scent, the smells, the atmosphere of the place, and that stays with you. And then, of course, the major thing that you do get when you're little is the language and the cultural kind of imprinting. And I think I got a lot of that in Pakistan.
At the age of about 4, I started to speak Urdu with an English accent. So Mum said to my dad, right, we're going to have to stop speaking in English at home because she will not learn the language otherwise. So they did work very hard. And I'm very grateful they did that, actually, because as we know, you can translate things from one language to another, but it doesn't quite have the same feeling. I've noticed that in Urdu, with poetry particularly, it's used in a very emotional way. There's a certain resonance with certain words, and you just cannot try to translate those into English. It just would not work. The language unlocks the culture at the end of the day.
And Narmeen was exposed to all kinds of modern pop being made in the subcontinent, sounds that left a lasting impression.
It's the songs, when I hear them, I'll suddenly start singing with them even now. Because it never goes. It's in your long-term memory, from being a child.
I relate to Narmeen as a fellow child of diaspora. I still remember the day I got my first cassette tape at the local music shop in Hyderabad, India. I picked out Superuna by Runa Layla because of the image on the cover, a South Asian woman decked out in shimmering gold, holding a microphone defiantly in her glossy, red-tipped nails. She was a disco superheroine. To 4-year-old me, her image and sound were everything. A woman that looked like someone from my family, just way more glamorous, playing futuristic synthesized sounds.
Thank you so much for that, Arshia. That was really wonderful. My name is Sorayya Khan. Thank you to Beyond Baroque and to Sehba Sarwar for hosting this event. I'm going to read a few pages from the memoir that I'm currently working on. And some of tonight's material was previously published in my Raising Brown Boys essay in Long Reads. It's true that day was warm and beautiful in New York. Summer bled into fall, trees were gloriously green, the sky more Colorado than New York, the freshly washed school buses a striking yellow. The scene never lasts long in Ithaca, where trees shed leaves before we'd like and snow arrives with Halloween. I walked to the afternoon bus stop with my neighbor, as I did most days since moving to the street. She'd seen one of her children through elementary school while I was still new to the routine. Shahid had started kindergarten the previous Thursday without a backward glance as his little body climbed the bus steps behind Kamal, who was beginning 4th grade. The doors closed, the brakes released, and my relief was immediate. Time had moved back into my life, more precious than when parenting stole it, and I was free. We'd heard the news, of course. At first, the blaring radio in a repairman's white van on her side of the street was only a disruption. Sitting at my desk, facing the window I'd slammed closed, I was desperate not to squander a moment of work time. I turned up the volume on Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan's devotional song CD in my computer and checked email through our dial-up modem. As soon as I disconnected, the telephone rang and a friend gave me the news. By the time the phone call stopped, The towers had fallen and Muslims were suspects. Charlotte, our neighbor, was reserved in the best of times, but on our walk to the bus stop that afternoon, so was I. "It's such a beautiful day," she finally said. "Here, at least," I responded, my single nod to the morning's events, to which she didn't reply. I knew better than to say more. The metrics lay between us, the way facts sometimes take up space. She, white, me, brown, me, Muslim, worst of all, I imagine, me, Pakistani. The boys stumbled off the bus, careening into me like they still did in those days. Shahid running into my legs, Kamal close behind, but measured in his steps. As we walked home, the boys' chatter filled the air. In the laundry room, the children threw down their backpacks and took off their shoes, and I said I had something important to tell them. Moments later, I leaned back against the kitchen sink, the edge of it in my lower back, the two of them looking up at me, smaller than usual. I said that 2 airplanes had flown into 2 tall buildings in New York City. The buildings had come crashing down, and thousands of people were dead. The planes were likely piloted by Muslims, I added. When their faces were still blank, I wondered if the moment would define their young lives, the way Bhutto's hanging had defined mine. "By accident, Mama?" Kamal asked. "Why?" Shahid wondered. A while later, their lunch boxes clattered on the counter and water splashed in the sink as they fought to be first to wash their hands. Snacks were on the table, perhaps ants on a log, a recent trick of peanut butter, celery, and raisins learned from a friend. Eventually, I turned on the radio and set the volume low as Kamal bowed his head to math worksheets and Shahid to Harry Potter. That was their world at 9 and 5 as ours changed. Before the week was out, a boy his age told Kamal on the bus that he would come to our house and kill us all. He'd been Kamal's 2nd grade classmate when he bragged about owning a shotgun, a detail we discussed over dinner. I knew his father as much as I could know a man who dressed in fatigues on Tuesday afternoons and said nothing while we waited by the classroom door to take our children to after-school activities. The boy's name was Gunnar, not yet irony, merely fact, like the blonde crop of unruly hair which fell over his eyes. The same day, also on the bus, another child called Shahid a terrorist. Our kindergartner understood the import, but not the word. "What's a terrorist?" he asked at bedtime. "Someone who causes terror," I responded. "What's a terrorist?" he insisted, dissatisfied with my answer. "It depends on which side of a fight you're on," Naeem explained, because terrorist is complicated when you're a political science professor speaking to a 5-year-old who is your son, who has been to Pakistan, and like all 5-year-olds, understands a thing or two about justice. More than the boys' faces or what was said, I remember the window above the front door. After, when they were asleep and we were not, I stood and faced it at the top of the stairs. On a rare winter day, sunlight floods the stairs and transforms them into a perfect place to read. At that time of night, rather than mirrored reflections or evidence of the porch light outside, the window framed a perfect square of black. Naeem turned off a living room lamp, and the window leaned into the room, angles amiss, as if it too had moved. "Be careful," my mother said when we spoke, although I hadn't told her what had happened with the boys. It was the middle of the night for me, morning in Vienna, where she lived, and I'd called her. "I am careful," I replied, annoyed at the suggestion that I wasn't. "The world has changed, my darling," she said. "What do you think will happen?" "War, of course," she said. "It's always war." She was right, except it felt like it had already started. Thank you. I'd like to introduce our next writer, who is Mahmud Rahman.
Thank you, Sorayya. So 4 years ago, as the refugee and Muslim bans came down, Brooklyn Magazine published a series of personal immigrant and refugee stories called The Golden Door. And this is from that moment. 1972. Late on a January morning, you arrive at Heathrow after a long series of flights. This is the second time you've been in the air. You're planning to stop in London for a couple of days, then fly on to Boston, your final destination, Tulsa, Oklahoma, where you will start college. You hand over your traveling papers. Instead of a passport, you carry an identity certificate issued by India identifying you as a refugee from Dhaka. For just over a month, you have had a country, Bangladesh, formerly East Pakistan. Only a few countries have recognized the new republic. The UK has not. You don't have a diplomatic mission here. We cannot let you in. Politely, you respond, I have traveling papers. They say I can return to India. I have a ticket and visa for the US. I'm only stopping here to visit friends. We cannot let you in. You try again, holding back something in your voice. When they look at you, barely 18 years old, weighing 85 pounds, what do they see? No. What do I do, you ask? You can go into detention or we can put you on the next flight to Boston. If I accept detention, will my chances improve? No, you wait for 2 days until your flight. A TWA flight leaves within the hour. They retrieve your luggage, hurry you to a police car, and with your second-hand wool coat flapping in the cold wind, you climb onto the plane lugging the suitcase in your hand. You think people on the plane look at you like you're some criminal being deported. Crossing the Atlantic, you wonder how you'll be treated when you land. When you arrive at Logan, mourning there as well, the official looks at your papers and greets you with a smile. Welcome to America. You're the first person from Bangladesh. The US has not recognized Bangladesh either. In fact, it supported the war against your people, but this man takes your travel papers. You exhale. The ground feels solid again. You are stopping in Boston for a few days to visit your older sister who teaches at a Catholic girls' school in Newton. But you're 2 days early and you only have $1 in your pocket. Outside the airport, there is snow on the ground. You've never seen snow before. The temperature is 18 degrees and a wind blasts your face and your mouth goes numb and your words freeze. You board the shuttle to the T, then a blue line car headed for Government Center. You're to change here for the green line, one bound for Riverside. But there are too many green line options. You get confused and you end up on the street outside the station. You have no change to go back and try again. You find a cab. The taxi ride is a blur. You haven't seen your sister and her children since they emigrated here 2 years ago. Years later, you'll still remember piles of snow outdoors, central heat inside, a soft bed with fitted sheets, chilled cranberry juice at breakfast. Your sister will show you Cambridge and downtown Boston. She will get you a warm parka. At MIT, you are greeted by the Rosa Luxemburg Students for a Democratic Society, handing out leaflets protesting the British Army murders in Belfast on Bloody Sunday. You like what you see of Boston, a thickly urban city, efficient mass transit, universities, engaged students. You fly on to Tulsa and start college. You try to resume a normal life, and in the gaps, you try to sort out the last year of life when you became a refugee uprooted by war. 1971. Just a year ago, your life had a certain normalcy, perhaps even innocence. Then came a night of gunfire, and you entered a world you read about in books. You were in your final year of secondary school, but the times were turbulent and you'd lost interest in schoolwork. You were not unfamiliar with military rule. Just a couple of years ago, the opposition had brought down a decade-long dictatorship. Elections had been promised and delivered, but the military refused to respect the results in which the Nationalist Party you supported won an overwhelming majority. The people rose in rebellion. The military responded with mass slaughter. They came for Hindus, for politicians, for rebellious youth. You and a brother 3 years older figured you would be targeted. Like thousands of others, your mother thought it prudent to leave the city. You joined her with other relatives, retreating to her father's village, a place you had never visited. You stayed there for some weeks until the soldiers arrived there and set fire to Hindu homes. You returned to the capital, but not home. Feeling useless but at risk, you wanted to find a way to engage. You decided to flee across the border to India. 2 attempts failed when you couldn't find the contacts to guide you across. The 3rd time, you joined your brother and a deserting soldier, and this time after a journey on bus, auto rickshaw, and on foot, you made it across. You are lucky. You do not have to live in a refugee camp or hustle for shelter. Your eldest brother's wife has relatives in Calcutta and they welcome you. You reconnect with some schoolmates. You try to make yourself useful. With 3 friends, you do a stint at a training camp on the border. On the way back, you get jailed, accused of being Pakistani spies. Some of you enlist in the final weeks of the war, but you've been disturbed by what you've seen among some of your leaders and partisans and comrades. Your mind is on fire and you do not know what to do. Meanwhile, your brother in the United States has been wanting you to move there for college. You've put him off. You're not too keen on America, though you accept that America is more than its president. Soon, the war ended. Your homeland now free, you trekked home. With your earlier idealism cracked, many things not feeling right, you agree to move to the United States. You're in 1972. You're in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where some of your family have emigrated. Culturally, you're prepared for America. Schooled by missionaries from the United States, you're fluent in English. Your family subscribed to Lifetime and Reader's Digest. In TV, you had watched Dr. Kildare, The Fugitive, and Mission Impossible. Tulsa feels far from the world familiar to you. You have family, teachers, and friends, but it is hard for others to relate to what you've gone through. You find it hard to even formulate the questions you have. The library becomes your refuge. You encounter Sartre and Camus. Their writings in the aftermath of war speak to you. You discover Emma Goldman, Danilo Dolci, Thomas Merton. Tulsa continues to feel remote and you seek out a transfer. You think Boston will fit you better. New worlds open to you there. You find more like-minded people. Soon after you arrive, though, Boston is caught up in near race war. Witnessing images of Black children in school buses set upon by white mobs, how can you stay passive? You love what Boston as a big city offers, but you are also called spick and nigger and assaulted once. You arrived on refugee papers, but are no longer a refugee. You came as a foreign student, intending to return. With time, you become an immigrant. Some of it has to do with the distancing hand of time. It takes 10 years before your first visit home. Some of it has to do with love and relationships. Some of it has to do with your belief that you should engage with the world around you wherever you live. You move multiple times to the Midwest, back east, then all the way to the West. You realize you will never fully belong anywhere again, but at a certain point you discover that you have made this country your home. Thank you. And our next writer is Shreerekha Subramanian.
Thank you, Mahmud. Thank you, Sehba, Beyond Baroque, and my fellow panelists, and of course, all the audience who has stuck through till now. The best act is yet to follow after me, so stay put. And I have 3 poems to read for you. The first that I'm going to start is a poem that I wrote the night of January 6th. It's called A Gift. What was hidden is now plain for all to see. Ruse of political correctness, now rage, marches in combat boots, armed, mutinous, T-shirts emblazoned Camp Auschwitz by those who also deny its veracity. What might seem like end times is also a gift. Those angered left out of university classes of ethnic studies, critical race studies, so many other centric fields in the disillusion of Eurocentric curricula, epistemes, can now follow along and read in sync what the rest of us, scholars, visionaries, singers, activists, artists, poets have been hollering, the indigenous now for 5 centuries straight. Decolonizing every waking moment with song, dance, memory, food, ritual, story, wisdom. What might seem like end times is also a gift. Their claim to greatness is whiteness, and its direct inheritance, pie pieces, privilege, currencies heavy in pockets bereft of moral claims on the conscience of a nation. Now, those very citizens can finally read pages from our books in the multitudes of languages summing up American ideology, writ large on bodies and blood. Privilege comes packing. The privilege that renders Palisades in blue null when faced with entire mobs pillaging, breaking, entering sacrosanct houses of democracy. The same blue that fires upon a man declared bad on sight from high on above in a helicopter. Logic? He deserved to be shot dead for simply being, existing, breathing, while Black. Examples so numerous, charts run way back into an accounting book that stopped counting the violence against Black, Native, othered bodies on which the nation has been formed. So this here is really its own image reflected back like Narcissus. What might seem like end times is also a gift. Demagogue whines, harumphs, tweets, his minions follow his bidding. An idiom of revolutionary zeal for liberty tied into collective doubt, anxiety, distrust of the other. Accept this, for it is as American as tamales, tater tots, Teflon. Protest, dissent, march, speak up, practices of decolonization now taken up by the marauders of democracy. But they're not anomalies, mutations, this thing no aberration, but a visual representation in flesh and tweet of the idiom of whiteness itself. What was hidden is now plain for all to see. What might seem like end times is also a gift. The next 2 poems I have are for my children, primarily for my son who is about to fly the nest, fly the coop. So the first poem is called Rescue. And as he's about to fly the coop, I'm deciding that what I need to give him, I don't have much wisdom to give him, I think, but I have a book of poems I'm writing to give him when he leaves our home. Rescue. COVID evenings continue late into the fall. Leaves fall here late anyway. Some odd reason you join me to walk the dog in the park. Armed with my nightlight, bags, and exuberance to have you and puppy in tow, we reach the main boulevard. When he does his usual tricks, bites the leash, and we both try to grab him at once. And I do what I told you not to do, and before we know it, in the tug, the dog is free. Cars everywhere, you scream, chagrined, I counter, neither ready to accept fault. And before we can grasp him back safe in harness, he flies into the rush hour traffic, into the meridian, back and forth on the grassy knoll, then back, skidding between traffic as cars screech to a halt, horns blaring, drivers alarmed at the scurry of white on their windshield. Me screaming his name again and again, throat raw, and you running after him over and over, calling him gently, running strategically, so he chases and comes back to safety. I begin to lose hope early, howling each time he scampers away from a car, uncertain which way to run, then jets back to us, past us, around us in circles, as I keep calling miles, miles, miles. Mad incantations at decibel levels, cacophonous for passersby, each time the distance greater, the what-ifs dooming my calls. You persist in your search for him. You run, keep running. You call his name over and over. But unlike me, you do not take time out for yourself or your worries or your dejection. You continue the struggle and keep going. your feet pattering after him, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, but circling, till you, with the aid of a good Samaritan puppy in tow, helps, and you bring Miles back to his mommy, who by now is a pile of helpless palms flat down on knees, kneeling on pavement, poop bag in one hand, harness in another, of no use except as arms to welcome home son and animal back to safety. Of you, I have no fear. Not only will you be all right, those around you will benefit from your compassion for human and animal alike, as I have from day one. Still shaking your steady hand on his collar, another arm around my shoulders, we walked home in the dark, quiet, the leaves brown and brittle scrunching underneath our feet, and I started counting alongside our footsteps since the day you alighted with your berry black eyes, a bundle in my arms, so celestial light shot right through my heart. 1,000, 10,000, 1,000,000 maybe, or more, like the stars. Is it possible to count the number of times you rescued me? Quietly, we reach our front door and enter our home, shaken, silent. Puppy flops on the floor, depleted after his run. The two of us return to our routines, and I begin to count again. And the last one is a short poem also for my son. It's called My Son, My Daughter's Co-Mother. So confusing. My son, my daughter's co-mother. My son, my co-mothering partner since forever, since she came, since I needed help with her first night at home, her diapers in the dark, the songs needed to put her back to sleep, the sudden laughter needed to convulse her little belly, legs upturned, and now, even now, years later, she, a lanky teenager taller than me, and you, freshly hatched 18, towering above us at 6'1", counsel her, coach her, tutor her in every subject. Hold her hand when she's down, inspire her when she feels doomed, inject hope when the lights go out, and still laugh together at old dark comedies you both enjoy, snarking together at my millennial faux pas, my neo-lib flaws, Gen Z jokes I can't, nah, don't even go. There I stand, still washing dishes, still cleaning up like any mother anywhere, while watching you carry the weight of mothering my daughter. That's all from me. Our final writer for tonight is none other than the wonderful Sehba Sarwar.
Thank you. I am just so blown away by just the amazing, amazing work. Oh, wow. I'm glad this is recorded. So we will have this to review. I'm going to read a piece well, I'll just start reading. Borders repel me, yet I am drawn to the line so I can document the bloodshed and history marked by fences and walls. I've been able to cross North American borders by car or by foot, but those in South Asia remain crossable only, and sometimes, if one is lucky, by air. 6 years ago, I obtained a police reporting visa to visit family in 3 cities in North India. The prose I will read this evening is a mix of an essay I wrote for Aman Ki Asha, a peace initiative started by my sister Beena Sarwar. She's in the audience, I see her. And an informal interview that I conducted in Delhi with Kashmiri artist Veer Munshi. This piece is called No City Feels Like Home, a quote by Veer Munshi. In the dim light before dawn, my airport taxi meanders between neighborhoods in Delhi as the driver searches for my hotel. The taxi passes an elephant, an owner trundling along the street. Exhausted from my 24-hour flight, I rub my eyes and peer out of the window to make sure I'm seeing what I'm seeing. But the bulky mammal has faded away in Delhi's winter mist and smoke. I am used to sighting animals along Karachi streets, where camels, horses, donkeys, with carts and carriages or without, often slow down traffic. And I know that animal owners depend on their beasts for transportation and income, but this is my first sighting of an elephant on a city street. Later, when I tell my Delhi-based friend Fawzia, who attended school with me in Karachi and is now in Delhi living with her Indian husband, she nods. People rent elephants, for weddings, she says. They walk to different parts of town, and sometimes they have to start before dawn to cover 30 miles. But then, after my long journey from Houston to Delhi, all I want to do is collapse on a bed. At the hotel where I spend my first 8 hours before moving to Fauzia's house, the hotel owner is worried. Ma'am, we must submit photocopies of your passport and your police reporting form to the police, he tells me. I remember police reporting from more than 30 years ago when I flew several times from Delhi to Delhi from Karachi with my mother and siblings. Back then, my sister, brother, and I did not even need passports. We were simply names handwritten in our mother's passport. But even then, as a Pakistani visiting India, my mother had to report her arrivals and departures at police stations. Since those early visits, I have returned to India a couple of times as an adult. The first time was as a graduate student when I interned at the Telegraph in Calcutta. Back then, through family connections, I managed to get a police exempt visa. And a decade later, I returned as a tourist on my American passport. No police reporting required. But since the 2007 Mumbai attacks, India's 9/11, the process for US-based Pakistanis holding dual nationality has changed. Those who wish to apply on US passports have to relinquish their Pakistani nationality, or else they must apply on their Pakistani passports. I chose the latter option, which means restricted travel on an approved city or two, but not a visa to the country, and police reporting, of course. I'll jump to the end of the essay. In the end, the only things that I find different in Delhi versus being in Karachi is the elephant that I never see again, and the freedom on the streets, even though Delhi is not the safest place for women. Certainly, the autonomy I enjoy is connected to education and privilege, but the open environment is something I don't experience in Karachi anymore. When visiting Delhi universities, I don't need to go through metal detectors as I would if I were in Karachi. Through my entire visit, I am able to wander in and out of Indian International Center, the IIC, where many seminars and book launches occur. No one ever asks to search me or questions who I am. Instead, in that space, I have many border-free encounters. One evening, I run into family friend and Pakistani poet, Kishwar Nahid, who is about to give a reading. She greets me with a hug. Another afternoon, I have a spontaneous visit with a Mumbai-based academic who is submitting work for my organization's Borderlines publication. On my last afternoon in the city, I returned to the IIC to meet Kashmiri artist Veer Munshi for lunch. He also is contributing work to my organization's publication and productions. My art practice has become political turned personal, Veer tells me. I have migration within me. I am always walking and never settled. I never untie my shoes to sit down and relax. Life is different from my childhood when I had afternoons and evenings to rest. Now, home, you make anything and everything. And you are detached from your physical space. Transit becomes your way of life. And home is multiple, where you come from and where you are going. No city feels like home. When I tell Veer that I want to visit Kashmir, he says, let's go, we can catch a flight to Srinagar. As a Hindu Kashmiri, Veer knows he will be relatively safe, though he also opposes the Modi government's repression of Muslims in Kashmir and all over India. I shake my head. With my visa, I can only visit Delhi, Allahabad, and Aligarh. I can get a car, he says, and we can drive to Srinagar. We don't need passports to cross province lines. I will show you my home. My eyes tear up. Tempting as his offer is, I have to catch my return flight to Houston. And the risk of being caught by the Indian Army is too big. That evening, I fly out of Delhi, not knowing if I will ever be able to return to my parents' first home again. I also know that my desire to set foot on the Indian side of Kashmir is a wish that will never be realized. Since my 2014 visit to Delhi, the Modi government has tightened its grip on Kashmir. The Muslim majority state has been stripped of its special status. Young men continue to vanish and are tortured in detention centers. In 2020, the year that will be remembered for the pandemic, Kashmiri people's struggle for justice has faded from the world's consciousness. My reading in tonight's gathering is dedicated to the people of Kashmir whose lives have been lost and whose futures remain risky and uncertain. Thank you. Thank you everybody so much for coming, for joining us this evening. I just have to again thank all the amazing writers. Each one of you just have moved me. I'm so glad we were able to put this together. Quentin, thank you, and Beyond Baroque, Jimmy Vega, thank you. And to all the organizations, and I see your representatives in the audience. Thank you to Poets and Writers, to the Los Angeles Poets Society, the Chucha Press, and Tuesday Night Project for co-sponsorship. Also to the South Asian Network, South Asian American Digital Archive, Bookswell, Pakistan Arts Council, and all of you for coming tonight. The next Beyond Baroque show is called Poets Translate Poets. Please join in and support them. I will be there as audience. I am a fan of Beyond Baroque. And thank you again for this evening. And I think we will sign off, correct? Quentin, did you want to say anything more? Does anybody want to show your faces and wave goodbye?
Thank you, Sehba. Thank you, everybody.
And we can make a gallery view of everybody. Yes? Everybody. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
And I've saved the chat, so I will get to see what everybody said, and I will respond to you personally, because there was no way to respond while reading. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sehba.
You're very welcome,
Bye,
each one of you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.